Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this year's British Kuwait Friendship Society Book Prize presentation. This year we're unable to meet in person, so the ceremony is going to have a very different format from the one which we're used to. So I've been asked just to run very quickly through the order of events. We're hoping that the Ambassador, Mr. Khaled Al-Duwaysan, is going to be able to join us shortly to give the formal opening ceremony. Ambassador Khaled Al-Duwaysan is the Ambassador of the State of Kuwait, the Dean of the Diplomatic Corps and Chairman of the British Kuwait Friendship Society. Once he's opened proceedings and given the formal welcome address, he's going to be followed by Frances Guy. Frances is a former ambassador to Lebanon and Yemen, and she's currently the UNDP Regional Gender Advisor based in Amman, and she's also chair of the judges. Frances is going to highlight some of the exceptional titles which we've had entered this year, focusing on the shortlist. She'll then introduce the two runner-up titles, as well as following that by introducing us to the two runner-up authors. She's then going to move on to announce the prize-winning title, and we'll have a conversation between the prize winner and Professor James McDougall, which is going to be moderated for us by Charles Tripp on behalf of the judges. Now I'm going to leave Charles to do the formal introductions to that when we reach that part in the ceremony. We're going to give plenty of time following the conversation for a question and answer session, and I would urge you to use a button at the bottom of your screen, right at the bottom in the middle that it says Q&A. And if you find you have any questions you'd like to put when the conversation is ongoing, please do put them in and Charles will then take them to our winning author. And finally, during the Q&A session, we're going to put a link to the Book Prize website in the chat function. This links the shortlisted and winning titles. So if you click on that, you'll be able to find out much more information about them. And also within a couple of clicks, you'll be taken to the publisher's website, so you'll be able to buy them. And then you can read them at your leisure after the event if you'd like to do so. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over so we can start the ceremony formally. I don't think the ambassador's been able to join us quite yet.
But
so
we have a representative, Hamid Al-Khalifa, has just mentioned in the Q&A that he's representing the ambassador. So I don't know if you can unmute him.
Just bear with me. Yeah. Here we go. He'll join us. Sorry, he'll join us now as a panelist, and then we'll have the opening address as planned. Thank you very much, everyone.
Yes, hi, greetings from London. My name is Khaled Al-Khalifa. I'm the Deputy Chief of Mission of the Embassy of Kuwait. Unfortunately, His Excellency, the Ambassador and the Dean to the Court of St. James is feeling a bit unwell, so he called me a few minutes ago and asked me to urgently participate on his behalf, as he was keen to be represented here and do his job even when he's in bed. So I am, if I may, I have a speech here. If I may deliver it on his behalf, I'll be happy to do that.
Please go ahead.
All right. So this is the speech by the Ambassador of the State of Kuwait and the Dean of the Diplomatic Corps to the Court of St. James, His Excellency Khaled Al-Duwaysan, the Chairman of the Kuwaiti British Friendship Society, to the Book Prize 2020. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, firstly, allow me to extend my sincere appreciation for you all for holding this very important meeting virtually. We are grateful for technology, which allows our crucial work to continue despite the challenges posed by a pandemic that has crippled the world and changed our lives beyond recognition. Secondly, I am pleased and honored to welcome you to this special evening on behalf of the Kuwaiti British Friendship Society, which has been awarding this annual prize to the best scholarly work in Middle Eastern studies since 1998. This extremely valuable cultural project would not have been possible without the support and efforts exerted by Sheikh Abdullah Al Mubarak Al Sabah Foundation. May I take this opportunity to thank them for their generosity in sponsoring these prestigious events year after year. Their commitment to promoting Middle Eastern studies in British universities through various scholarship schemes is greatly valued. I would also like to extend my most sincere thanks and appreciation to His Excellency Sheikh Mubarak Al Abdullah Al Mubarak Al Sabah for his generosity, which benefited many students over the years. His commitments and his tireless efforts made this important event thrive and keep going since it was founded in 1996 with His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales and Her Excellency Sheikh Dr. Saad Al Sabah are amongst his honorary presidents and to whom we are ever so grateful. Many thanks are also owed to the organizing committee and the judges for deciding on the winning books. At the same time, allow me to congratulate the winners of this valuable prize. Your hard work has paid off. Today, we hope that you will all feel encouraged and inspired to write and contribute further to this cultural treasure. Distinguished guests, the book prize is another demonstration of how highly culture and arts are valued in the state of Kuwait. Under the guidance of His Highness, the late Emir Sheikh Sabah Al Ahmed Al Jaber Salah, and will continue under the new leadership of His Highness Sheikh Nawaf Al Ahmed Al Jaber Salah. Kuwait is keen to exert every effort to promoting and protecting culture, art, and literature, especially our Islamic culture with its very rich and diverse heritage. Kuwait continue to exert efforts to spreading cultural awareness and enlightenment, intellection, as well as strengthening the cultural role and protecting the world culture heritage at home and abroad. Kuwait is keen to developing various creative and cultural industries for today's generation that it intends to hand it on to future generations. I wish those in charge of the Sheikh Abdullah Mubarak Al Sabah Foundation every success and continuation of the positive role they play in promoting our British relations, particularly in culture and scientific fields. And I also wish for this event to be successful as it was every year. Thank you again for being here tonight. And this is the end of His excellent speech. And again, I convey his regards and his best wishes for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Khalifa. Would you please convey our best regards to the ambassador on all of our behalf, on the judge's behalf, but also on everybody who's here's behalf. The ambassador's always been a very gracious host to this book prize and has, as most of you know, kindly hosted us in his embassy for nearly every year for the last 20 years. We're very sorry not to be there with him today, but also we're very sorry to hear that he's not very well. So please do convey our best wishes, and thank you very much for being here and being present with us today. My name's Frances Guy. I'm the chair of the panel of judges, and I would like to start by introducing my fellow judges, many of whom are with us tonight. First of all, Sheikh Mubarak Al Abdullah Al Mubarak Al Sabah, Professor Carol Hillenbrand, Professor Emerita of Islamic History at the University of Edinburgh and Professorial Fellow at the University of St Andrews, Professor Yasser Suleiman, University of Cambridge, Professor Charles Tripp, Professor Emeritus of Politics in the Middle East and North Africa at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, and Sir Roger Tomkis, sometime British Ambassador to Bahrain and later Syria, and Master of Pembroke College, Cambridge from 1992 to 2004, and who has been associated with the prize since its inauguration. On behalf of all the judges, I would like to thank His Excellency Sheikh Mubarak Al-Abdallah Al-Mubarak Al-Sabah for his personal interest and support for the prize, which is funded by the Abdallah Al-Mubarak Al-Sabah Foundation. The prize is a celebration of scholarly work on the Middle East in the widest sense, in that we include studies on Turkey and Iran, as well as works on Islamic studies, and books from diverse areas, including art, literature, sociology, history, economy, international relations, and many others. Before I mention the shortlist and the prize winners, I'd like to take the opportunity to remind you of the criteria we use for selecting the winners. These are originality, clarity and accessibility, and importance to the field. The judges also try to assess how well the book enhances the understanding of the subject matter to a wider audience. And you may have noticed I'm probably the least academic on the panel of judges, so I take a personal interest in ensuring that any works are accessible. Also making everything possible are a number of anonymous reviewers who help guide the judges in their selection, and I would like to thank all of them for their hard work as well. The prize attracts around 50 submissions every year, and whilst we all do our best to read every book, and possibly this year we've managed all of us to read every book, the thoroughness of the reviews helps always to guide us. This year we announced a short list of 6 books from 6 different publishers about 6 very different subjects. And that in itself, I think, demonstrates the diversity of the submissions we received this year. The shortlist and the details of all the books are available on our website, but I would like to take a few minutes, if I may, to mention, first of all, the 3 books that did not make the final prize list, and then mention the runners-up and the winner. Our shortlist included The Life of the Red Sea Dhow by Dionysius Agios, published by I.B. Tauris. This is in fact the 4th great book by Agios on the maritime culture of the Gulf, the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. And it encapsulates a life's work in preserving an all but vanished world by chronicling the memories of those who peopled it, or who are still just about peopling it. It's a wonderful book and we all enjoyed reading it. Another lovely book is A Monument to Medieval Syrian Book Culture, The Library of Ibn Abdul-Hida by Konrad Hirschler, published by Edinburgh University Press. Our reviewer noted that for anyone interested in medieval Arabic book culture, Arabic manuscripts, or both, this book is indispensable. Hirschler's uncomplicated style and his way of marshalling his evidence, reminiscent of a detective novel, render the first part of the book amazingly readable. I would add that the book is also full of excellent pictures. Our shortlist also included Age of Coexistence, The Ecumenical Frame and the Making of the Modern Arab World by Usama Makdisi, published by University of California Press. Our reviewer noted that this book is provocatively argued and eloquently written, and is an important new work by one of the leading modern historians of the Arab East. It is a book that will get widely read and will prove influential in scholarship. It's also a book that left me with a hope that sectarianism is not inevitable. I'm delighted to move now to the 2 runner-up titles. The first runner-up is Friends of the Emir, Non-Muslim State Officials in Pre-Modern Islamic Thought by Luke Yarbrough, published by Cambridge University Press. Our reviewer noted that this work is truly outstanding and groundbreaking. It presents a sophisticated and thorough discussion of pre-modern opposition to the employment of non-Muslims as state officials. Overall, the work is written in a lucid and engaging style and enhances the understanding of the subject matter for a wider audience, both scholarly and non-scholarly. I would say, though, we did feel that although the book is accessible to all, those with some prior understanding of Islamic history will get the most from it. I'd like to congratulate Professor Yarborough, who's with us today, and I think would like to say a few words. Please.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Guy. As pleased and grateful as I am this evening, I'll be very brief. It was an immense honor to me that my book was shortlisted for this prestigious distinction, the British Kuwait Friendship Society Book Prize. But it was nothing less than a shock, though a gratifying one, that the book was named a runner-up among such truly excellent company, alongside Professor Leor Halavi's Modern Things on Trial. I would like most sincerely to thank the Sheikh Mubarak Al-Abdallah Al-Mubarak Al-Sabah Foundation and His Excellency the Ambassador, Mr. Khalid Al-Duwaysan, and Mr. Khalid Al-Khalifa, who's with us this evening, as well as each and every one of the judges who have already been introduced. I'm looking forward very much to our discussion this evening of Professor As-Sarraf's Electric News in Colonial Algeria. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. You kindly forewarned everybody what I was about to say, but that's fine.
I'm sorry to have preempted you.
So, no problem. Our other runner-up, as those of you who are observant will have already noticed, is Modern Things on Trial, Islam's Global and Material Reformation in the Age of Ridda, from 1865 to 1935 by Leor Halavi, published by Columbia University Press. Our reviewer noted that this is a remarkable study of an interesting and important period in history. It is enjoyable to read Halavi describe how fatwas are not only deductions of texts, but are also intimately related to people's everyday lives. The book is clear and accessible, and at the same time very scholarly. I'm also pleased that Professor Halavi is with us today and would like to offer my sincere congratulations to him and maybe ask him to say a few words too. Thank you. Yes. Please go ahead.
Thank you. I am delighted to be here. Thank you for including me in this event. I'm very grateful to the Kuwaiti sponsors of Middle East Studies and how they facilitate this celebration of scholarship in the field. Also extremely grateful to the judges for reading so many books. Among the people I see here on screen and the participants listed are so many whose scholarship and books I admire, and grateful that you took the time to read my book as well as many others, and assembled in the end a terrific short list, which now will be part of my Christmas shopping list, so I can keep entertained and edified and guided by your selections. And I'm glad here to I guess attend this event and celebrate the winner.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And indeed, we will move to the winning title, Electric News in Colonial Algeria by Arthur As-Sarraf, published by Oxford University Press. And before I hand over to Charles Tripp to moderate a discussion with Dr. As-Sarraf about his book, I wanted to share with you a few reasons why we selected this book. Firstly, the reviewer noted that the fluency of the text and the author's accomplishment as a vivid storyteller set it apart. The research underpinning the book runs deep. Written with the aid of multiple archives in Arabic, French, Spanish, and Italian, it puts Algerian Muslim experiences of French colonialism as well as their most intimate thoughts about it, at the heart of a thematically organized narrative. You will hear much more about it just now, but I would like to say that I have this wonderful picture in my mind of Muslim women gathered round a radio set, distilling what they hear in order to decide what to believe. The electric news of the title is, of course, both literal and metaphorical. Congratulations to Dr. Asraf, and please let me hand over to Charles to lead us through a discussion of your book. Thank you.
Francis, thank you very much indeed. And again, congratulations to Arthur for an outstanding book. Amongst, as you will have got the impression already, a series of really outstanding books. So it is quite an achievement given the ones that were in the competition this year as well. So congratulations also to the runners-up and to those on the shortlist, and indeed to many others whom we couldn't mention this evening. The idea this evening is to have a short conversation between Arthur Asraf and James McDougall about the book, and then for perhaps about a quarter of an hour or so, and then we can open the floor, metaphorically, to people who have questions to put to either or both of them, I imagine to the author in particular. And I'll be collating the questions that people type in and then passing them on afterwards. So don't feel that you have to wait until the two discussants have finished speaking until you type in your question. Just want to introduce Dr. Arthur Asraf is the author of the winning volume, as you know, and he's a lecturer in the history of France and the Francophone world at Cambridge University, as well as a fellow of Pembroke College. And Professor James McDougall is Professor of Modern and Contemporary History at the University of Oxford and a fellow of Trinity College. And I'm sure any of those working on North Africa, and particularly on Algeria, will be very familiar with James's work and of course with his name. So I'm happy to hand over to James to start the conversation with Arthur, and we'll see how it goes.
Thank you very much, Charles, and thanks, Guy, and thanks to the sponsors of the prize and to all of you for being here. I guess this is there are surprising, unanticipated positive outcomes of the current awfulness, and the unusual idea to turn part of this evening's prize-giving ceremony into a sort of seminar, short and very informal sort of seminar, accessible sort of seminar on the book is maybe one of those. So Arthur and I are going to talk back and forth a little bit about the book, and hopefully if people do have questions, please do type them in, and do start doing that as soon as you like, so that Charles can then feed those into the conversation. I'm not going to talk for very long. In fact, Charles will stop me, I hope, if I look like I'm going to be talking for too long. And we'll open up the screen, as it were, to a larger conversation. I just have two opening comments really to make. I mean, aside from the obvious one that's already been made, that it's really a mark of how good Arthur's book is, that it managed to carry off this extraordinary prize against such extraordinary competition. It also says something, I think, about where Algerian history has come to over the last maybe 20 years. I'm going to be slightly mischievous and say that it tells us something that in the last 3 years, this prize has been won twice by books on Algeria, which is surprising. I think would have been surprising to anyone in the field of Anglophone, Middle Eastern and North African studies 20 or 25 years ago. That would not have looked at all likely. And I wonder if Arthur, one of the first things we could talk about is what the book says about where Algerian history is now, what the questions you're able to ask now says, both about the accessibility of sources and the kinds of sources that we've begun to be using, and also the way in which Algeria has been related to the larger history of the Arab world, of the Middle East and of North Africa. There's a phrase that people use a lot in writing in French about Algerian history recently, which is to talk about le désenclavement, over the history of Algeria. And there's not a really good English translation of that, but I guess we could say the deparochializing, or the kind of taking out of isolation of Algerian history. For quite a long time, Algeria was an unusually under researched country in English language scholarship on the region. There were an obvious number of very good reasons for that, and I think your book is a real indicator both of methodologically and thematically taking Algeria out of its isolation, treating it as particular in all kinds of ways, which it is, but also seeing the ways in which what you're looking at, which is the connection of Algerian space and Algerian people in the colonial period between 1880 and 1940 to other places by news, rumor, telegraph, radio, and so on, the ways in which that allows us to open up other histories of Algeria that maybe aren't just about an isolated place and its face-to-face relationship with colonial France. And the second thing is to open up from that really and to think about what the book tells us about global history and wider historiographies. There's a big and important argument here in the book, not only about Algeria, but about the relationship between news, social communication, political action, social identities, and globalization. And there's an argument with Benedict Anderson and Benedict Anderson's iconic book, Imagine Communities, which is an important argument, I think, and maybe one that's worth talking about a little. And there's also an argument about the perhaps surprising ways in which increasingly intense connection and increasingly intense webs of the transmission of news and the increasing speed of the transmission of news in the period you're talking about doesn't always work to flatten space and bring people together, as the simpler earlier 19th and early 20th and indeed early 21st centuries of globalization assumed, but actually work to drive people further apart, to create what you call a kind of jagged ecosystem of social relations. And that I think is one of the most striking things about the book. It foreshadows actually a lot of the arguments about the differential effects and the frictions of globalization that have become much more apparent in Europe and North America in the last 5 or 6 years. And it really throws that argument back into that much older period that we're used to thinking about in terms of global integration and the global shrinking of space. What the book shows is that actually the way in which news is transported and moved more rapidly across large spaces in this period actually in many respects serves to exacerbate and sharpen social differences. It doesn't just bring people together, it also drives them apart. So I wonder if you could say something about both those things, about what this tells us about Algeria specifically, but also what Algeria specifically tells us about much bigger global questions.
I hope you won't mind if I start answering by thanking a few people, but I'm actually going to do this in a way that hopefully will end up answering some of your questions. So I want to thank the judges for selecting my book, particularly among such a great shortlist, some of which are already some of my personal favorites. And of course, Sheikh Abdallah Mubarak Al-Sabah Foundation for supporting this prize, and His Excellency Khaled Al-Douaissane and Mr. Khaled Khalifa, who is here, for supporting scholarship in Middle East studies for over 20 years. And I think it takes a village to raise a book. So, my family, my friends, my colleagues, my teachers read the acknowledgements. That's always the most important section of a book. And if you read the acknowledgements of the book, the most important person of it is James, who was my doctoral supervisor. And the reason why this is important answers your question is because I think you're right, that the prominence of Algerian history as a field in recent years has been notable. And so I am building on and along with a number of people in I think a quite important movement. And it's been a real pleasure in my research and in writing this book, feeling like there's an emergent community and like really exciting things are happening. And I think that Algeria has been a really, really interesting space to ask a lot of these questions. And neither you or I are in fact Algerians. It's not because of that, really, I think that we have an automatic interest in this space, but because it allows us to ask such interesting questions. And it is a country that in English language media is poorly known, despite being the largest country in Africa, but that has tremendous importance as a place from which to observe the world. So I think that is a really important moment, and that this book and this recognition, which is amazing, I take as a collective recognition of where a number of us have arrived as a field, which is quite important. I guess in terms of answering your question, I was raised in France, and Algeria was appeared as a kind of problem that people would mention, but not as a real place. So partly what I was trying to do in this book was think about it as a place from which to look at the world, and how people in that colonial space tried to understand the world around them, and not see it externally as a problem. And in a way, this I think is a broader problem, which is that it is tempting nowadays to think of colonialism as something strange that is over, rather than to think of it as something central to the world and the way it exists, and what happens when you look at it as really being in the middle of things. So that's, I guess, the first thing. And I think one of the ways of doing that is to look for different kinds of objects. So one of the things that I was trying to do in this book is not look directly at political movements or at violent conflict, which is what has focused most of the attention. And this does feature in some respects, but looking at other objects in a way actually not dissimilar to Lior Halevi's book, who happens to be here, but looking at sort of particular technologies or objects. And this is also part of a wider trend in the historiography, right? So objects like the radio, the newspaper, and those have their own kind of temporalities that cut across a lot of the periods that we think of: before independence, after independence. And so that was part of the shift, that is that when I started out this book, I didn't think that this is what it was going to be about. And then I came to gradually look at the media, because it seemed like a really interesting place to understand the intersection of political history, social history, and intellectual history, which I think have been kept quite separate, not just in the study of North Africa, but in the study of the Arab world more broadly. I think we look at intellectual history, at least for the modern period, at a very limited set of figures. It's very difficult to kind of broaden our look out of that. And one of that is to look at sort of more quotidian experiences and more vernacular thinking about the world, which is what I tried to do here by putting media at the center. And I guess in terms of global history, there is an example from the book that I like to bring out when people talk about this. When there were the first television programs in Algeria and this happened during the Algerian War, so during conflict between the Algerian nationalist movement and the French government. The French government tried to have some programs where everybody would be represented, right? So the program would be simultaneously in French, in Arabic, and in Tamazight, in Kabyle in this case. And this created very strong reactions. A lot of the people wrote back complaints to the national broadcaster. And one of them is this sentence that I remember reading in the archive, and I was like, it's in 1961, and this woman says, "I'm not racist, but," which is always a great opening, "I'm not racist, but is it normal that I have spent a lot of money to buy a television and that I see Muslims on it all the time? Well, I see Muslims every day around me in my daily life, and this is not what I bought a television for." And there is something about this woman's complaint that was actually, to me, very revealing of what was going on. That people are using media technologies to not see the people that live immediately around them, and to feel closer to, in her case, a fantasized France that she wanted to be very close to. And that what she was raising was not just a kind of funny or strange remark, but actually quite central, not just to the way in which media worked in a very, very divided society like colonial Algeria, but the way in which it might work around us all the time. That a world in which we can imagine ourselves to be very, very far away from people who live geographically very close to us can only be built through media technologies. So those are essential to shaping the political geographies that we inhabit and that become visible, I think, in the 19th century through the globalization of information. And there are differences between the time that I'm talking about in the book and now, but you can see kind of traces of it. And of course, you know, when I was writing this, I was thinking about that, right? I was influenced by what was going on around us. Yeah. I think I'll stop there. I can talk more about Benedict Anderson, but we can do this now.
Yeah, I don't know how. I mean, I kind of want to push the Benedict Anderson thing, but it might not be the most interesting thing for everybody else. If that comes up in the Q&A, maybe we'll come back to it. I mean, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that, about maybe the difference. What's the difference, and what difference does colonialism or coloniality, or what difference does colonialism make, right? Because some of this argument does sound quite familiar, right? That we want to be connected through media to people we imagine as like ourselves, precisely in order to escape the people we live right next to whom we don't like or whatever, right? Or we want to imagine, and maybe this is part of the Benedict Anderson kind of argument, right? We want to imagine ourselves as part of a community with some people, right? And they're not necessarily the people who live right next door to us. So maybe the people that we imagine ourselves as sharing certain kinds of experiences with, who are very far away, and with whom we imagine ourselves as being in some kind of cultural continuity, right? And that can be religiously mediated too. I mean, there is a funny kind of way in which the media is a kind of secularization of a sort of religious community, you know, and again, this goes back to Anderson, right? So what is particular about this moment of globalization and the colonialism of it relative to, I don't know, similar kinds of critiques maybe that we could make of media and alienation and community and, you know, social fractures and frictions that flow across space now?
I mean, to be honest, it's something that I'm still thinking about, the exact distinction, what's colonial about it. Partly we can go back. So for those of you who might, you know, I'm aware that some members of my family are wondering and participants, Benedict Anderson wrote a book called Imagine Communities in the early 1980s, in which he said many things, but to summarize it very briefly, that nationalism is a form of imagining yourself in a community of people that you're never going to meet, and that the media plays, particularly the newspaper, but others as well, play an essential role in allowing yourself to imagine yourself as living at the same time as all these people that you're never going to meet. Now, I think that what Anderson was right about was the central role of the media in this. I think what he was less right about, and he admitted this himself later in his life, was that this only produces nation states, as opposed to other kinds of imagined communities. And that it produces, and that basically the nation state kind of swallows all the other communities and then they disappear. Now, there have been many critiques of this. And one of them is the secularizing one that you just mentioned. So, and in Algeria, this is quite visible. One of the things that I was interested in showing was that the way in which a newspaper industry emerges for the majority native Algerian population is specifically a Muslim newspaper industry. And these people do not describe themselves, at least initially, primarily as Algerians or Arabs, but as Muslims. And a whole brand of scholarship has tried to say that this is because this is how they were described legally under French colonialism, which is true, but also maybe they just thought that they were Muslims themselves. And that's how they looked at the world around them, much wider than Algeria. So that's one thing. But I think the other thing that Anderson did not really take into account is that the world in which his nations emerge is also a world in which colonialism exists. which means that the same process by which people are coming to them to imagine themselves as a national community is also a process by which they're imagining a division of the world, and a very wide division that runs between the colonizers and the colonized. And so I think that we need to rethink that. So how does that connect to now? I do think it's different, partly because what was clear in a colonial system is that there is one fracture that kind of dominates the others in the political imaginary. So the point is, I think what seems to happen, and other people looking at many other colonial situations have said this, is that under colonialism, even though there are other differences like gender or age or class, well, when things boil down to it, it always comes down to those two, right? The black, white, colonizer, colonized. And I think that's a bit different now. So I think some of the processes might be similar, but the way we interpret them is analytically less clear, as well as, of course, the technology, the material reality that this has.
Can we talk a little bit about, Charles, I'm going to rely on you to shut us up when we've done enough, but I'm going to carry on asking questions until you do that. Can we talk a little bit about the question about how Algeria fits into wider spaces and some of the other spaces that you talk about in the book? France obviously is one, Tunisia is another, a larger Muslim world is a third, the Ottoman Empire is important at some points, and Palestine is important as well. How does the book help us to think about the place of this very particular colonial space of colonial Algeria in the broader Middle East that other people might be writing about at this time?
Right. So I think to go back to some of the beginning of our discussion, part of the reason why Algeria has not been as prominent in Middle Eastern studies, particularly in English, but in other languages as well, is the peripheral position of the Maghreb and North Africa within the Arab world more generally. And so in terms of scholarship, but also in terms of the way in which kind of people imagine things politically, right? The centers are usually in Egypt and in the Levant. So partly, what I found, at least in my research, was not so much that Algeria was really at the center of things, because there would have been a different kind of research that would have said, actually, there were really important intellectual things happening in Algeria that influenced people in Egypt, for instance, and the direction was reversed. That might very well be the case, and that would remain to be seen. What I found was something a bit different, which is that the geographies were a bit more unexpected. So partly there is a very strong set of connections with neighboring Maghrebi countries, particularly Morocco, Tunisia, and Libya. And then beyond to the great intellectual centers of the Arab East, Cairo, Beirut, and also to the pilgrimage centers in Mecca and Medina. But that there was also a whole Mediterranean geography, which is partly to do with France, but also, and this is not something that I was expecting, to do with Italy and Spain, partly to do with migration patterns, a lot of Italian and Spanish settlers in Algeria, but also partly because, to be honest, I had not really thought about this, but if at a time where most long distance travel was by boat, Sardinia, Sicily, or the south of Spain are actually much closer to Algeria than other bits of Algeria or France. And you can see really at particular times like the Spanish Civil War or at particular diplomatic crises with Italy, or really that kind of density of connection becoming really obvious. It's really easy to move stuff across those straits. So I had kind of imagined Algerians to be much more interested in places very distant. Actually, a lot of it seemed to be on a kind of Mediterranean scale. One of the big discoveries of the research was that they were not very interested in sub-Saharan Africa. So this is an African country. This is something that is very important in political discourse now and has been since the 60s. Before, in the period where I'm looking at, it's remarkable how little people talk about events south of the Sahara, at least in what I was able to find.
James, I'm happy to let you both talk. Just to encourage others, if you have any questions, please type them in and I'll put them to the panelists. But at the moment, I'm enjoying the panelists. So, but please feel free to type in any questions. I'll put them to the panelists. Sorry, James.
That would be great. Otherwise, you're just stuck with us for another, I don't know, 10 minutes. So another question that I was going to open up is the question of the characters in the book. So Francis mentioned, you know, the vividness of some of the kind of little pen portraits that you draw, which are very beautiful, actually. And can you say something about the level of analysis in this? Because on the one hand, we're talking about, you know, trans-Mediterranean telegraph cables and news from modern-day Palestine, and, you know, intellectual networks that span across to the Hijaz. And at the same time, to me at least, and maybe this is just a personal preference thing, but one of the things that's really engaging about the book is the more micro historical scale of some of the stories that you tell, right? So we have very eccentric people sometimes in very small places doing very unexpected things. And there is a kind of quotidian, you know, social history of the uses of information here, which is in some respects very surprising. Can you talk a little bit about that? And what difference does it make to be trying to write a social history of the uses of news rather than just a history of kind of, you know, the spread of technology?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I mean, partly I think this has to do with my personal proclivities, which are both, which can be a weakness sometimes, which is I like weird stories. I like weird stories, I like weird people. And it's true that when I read archival documents, I found myself drawn to slightly unusual incidents and not to the routine stuff. That's also a product of how research works, right? You read page after page after page, and then something jumps out and you kind of organize it around it. I'm not sure if that's always a strength, to be honest, but that's how I chose to organize it. I think there's a deep intellectual reason for this, which was to try and focus on the quotidian and on the social and really expand this beyond limited elite circles, partly because this was a way of getting out of the problem we described about nations and newspapers and Benedict Anderson, because if you only look at the people writing newspapers, they believe that they're at the center of things. You know, just like if you ask Mark Zuckerberg or something today, right? If you want to understand what's going on, sure, you need to have those people in mind, but you need to look at it from other perspectives. So I was trying to understand it from as wide a variety of social actors as possible, which turned out to be surprisingly challenging. It's very difficult in a colonial society to write in a way that takes into account both settlers and the native population. And I found this very difficult to do narratively in a way that doesn't flatten people and doesn't flatten power relations. The other reason is that the main thing I drew on is police surveillance reports. And those are just self-contained little, plots. They have investigations, little characters show up. And so there are lots and lots of disturbances that happen around news and that form kind of the center of the book. So, there's a war that erupts somewhere. And then, there's some kind of riot that erupts in a cinema, and then they interrogate people. And then, you discover lots of people through that process and through chasing them. So yeah, that was I think the reason why I ended up like that.
Can I jump in with a question which actually follows from that, because I don't see any on my list at the moment. So I think that was one of the things that really attracted me to the book, and the strength of it was the subversive nature of the reception of news. Is you have people in broadcasting authorities, in censorship departments, in police departments, imagining the most terrible things, but also imagining that people will somehow believe them, and that somehow the news will have a uniform effect. And I think one of the things that struck me as extraordinarily interesting, but this is what the question must have been extraordinarily difficult to find out, is actually how people received all that. Is because what you get across, I think, very well in the book is the degree of skepticism, independent judgment, critique, not simply people saying, oh yes, that really happened, but actually proper skepticism that one would imagine from all sorts of motives possibly. But how, as a researcher, I mean, the official archive is easy to see what the officials thought, the media production and so on. The rest is surely quite serendipitous, isn't it? I mean, it's quite haphazard, but just to get a sense from how you struggled with that challenge.
I mean, yeah, it is. And I cannot say that I uncovered troves of documents that had not been looked at before. So this was a case, I think, of looking at things. I was reading documents that other people have read, looking for something else. But this is not some kind of major find where I unearthed things that had not been looked at before. Most of the surveillance documents that I was looking at are quite well known. But what I was looking at was not what they reveal about the political opinions of X or Y or Z, but what they reveal about what they knew about what was going on elsewhere and how they found out about it. So partly has to do with reading them differently, because when you read them differently, you do get a sense of the criticism, as you're saying, the kind of the analysis that people had of the news. And also you get the sense that this is actually a connection point between the colonial state and the people. So there are a number of cases, some of which I talked about in the book, but some of which actually did not make themselves into the book, which somebody wants a job or something from the government, but they're not being heard. The best way to be heard is to claim that somebody has conspired with some foreign power about some very recent and sensitive event. And then you immediately get the attention of somebody very high up in the government, and you can see the paperwork trail go up. So you'll say, I know that the British have more warships than the French, it's 1899, there's a competition. And then, you know, this whole kind of chain of paperwork gets created. So you get the sense that the government thinks that news about foreign places is important. People are aware of this. They are aware of these recent events. And so they use this connection to get things from the government. And from that, and then when you start reading the government sources like that, you see it more as about shared information between all these people than having to look somewhere else to find these things. But I did try and go as wide as possible to look at, you know, different songs, different ethnographic collections, but it is mainly just the government.
James, sorry, I interrupted.
No, not at all. If we've got time for one more, I mean, I want to on that question maybe a little bit, because there is a lot of popular culture here, right? So partly, I slightly hesitate to bring in a different kind of historiography, but there is something slightly Carlo Ginzburg, Cheese and the Worms-esque going on here as well, right? In terms of exactly what you just described, the surprising convergence of official information and popular culture and popular vernacular forms of knowledge, right? And can you say maybe a little bit more about the latter part of that? Because although, I mean, you're slightly underselling the things you found, I think. It's true that other people, including me, have read some of the same things that you were reading, but you did do some rather striking things with some of them. And there's a lot of popular poetry in here, quite a lot of popular song, you know, that whole question of the kind of vernacular public space, if not public sphere, which the colonial state is constantly and obsessively surveilling, but not really getting much of a grip on, and certainly very unable to control in any meaningful way, is really visible here. And again, what's striking is that you're not looking at that just for evidence of, you know, resistance or incipient nationalism or, you know, whatever it was that we were looking for 20 or 30 years ago. But that there are other things going on here in terms of popular culture and vernacular forms of knowledge that are existing in conversation with official media, print media, the newspaper, the telegraph. Can you say a little bit about how that world works? This is what you call the information ecosystem, right? But it's especially the kind of popular culture, anthropological bit of it that I'm interested in.
Yeah, I guess what I had to wrestle with was the assumption that we have that if you are, let's say, a peasant living in the mountains, you don't care about very distant events. And it's something that has come up when in my research, that people were like, well, they just wouldn't have cared about these things, right? They cared about their sheep and they cared about this. And so they wouldn't have cared about fascist Italy or, you know, events in Palestine. And so I spent a lot of time trying to prove that they did, and trying to find evidence for that. But then I also had to, they did, and the vocabulary they used to do so was often very schematic. It was like this big country, that big country, and you find this a lot in songs. You find it a lot about rhymes about particular countries taking over, taking power, but also that people related those issues very, very closely to their daily lives and to intimate struggles. And that's where moving from these diplomatic issues into the very intimate, into the very local, was to me really interesting, because you get sort of disputes erupting in villages between settlers and for instance, their employees in farms, based on events that were unfolding in the Ottoman Empire, that the people interpreted as directly relevant to their daily lives. And that I think made me wonder. It made me wonder about the ways in which we do that all the time. So when you, I don't know, watch the news or scroll through social media, what is the story that kind of resonates with something that is going on, and your mind kind of performs this analogy between something that happened somewhere very far away to people that you've never met and your own experience, and it kind of hits in some way. And that allowed me to feel much closer to the subjects that I was writing about, because I thought of them as performing a similar mental operation.
I have a couple of questions that have come in, if I may. One is said that this is from somebody who's participating. What can we learn from your research about journalistic work in places with ongoing forms of colonialism today? In other words, some sense of the resonance in the present world. And the other question was from Leo Halevi, who's there, but has typed in, it's quite long,
I could ask it if you prefer.
I think you get to ask it.
However you want it to work.
Please ask it, that would be good. I feel foolish reading out your own question to you.
I didn't know the process, sorry. I'm delighted to learn more about your book. It sounds so exciting and I can't wait to read it. One small point of connection that I found right away is I dealt with this fatwa from North Africa, I think it was from Tunisia, about the telegraphs. And one of the issues was that Christians were the ones operating these machines. And there was a question of mediation. What happens, especially if Muslims use this medium to communicate religious news when it's not in Muslim hands? I think a question that would also interest Luke Yarbrough, because he's very invested in cross-cultural communications. So anyway, this makes me think about religion, and you brought up Muslim newspaper industry. You also talked about television, and I guess I'm trying to hear more your reflections on the issue of religion media in Algeria. How does this work through television? How do you get at Muslim consumption, Muslim viewership, or maybe through other media, if you have better examples with that? Thank you.
Thanks very much. Arthur, a couple of questions for you. And then I think probably after that, we should bring the session to an end.
Okay, I'll try and be brief. The first question, I mean, it's a really, really good question. And I honestly think that you should ask the practitioners of journalists in those places. The one book that comes to mind actually is a really wonderful ethnography by Amal Bashara about Palestinian journalists. And when I was reading it, I was thinking of quite similar things, because there are processes in which certain people, okay, let me put it this way. The situation in Algeria is interesting in colonial times because there's a legitimate legal form of news that is prescribed by French authorities, and then there's all the other ones. And when you start reading it like that, and you see who gets paid and who has the rights to do it, and you think about it now, there are some interesting analogies that emerge. But I would say it's also different, because this is a system at the time that is very straightforward about what it's doing. And you know, colonialism at the time was not a bad word. It was explicit and people said it. And I think since the 60s, 70s, a number of shifts have happened, which is when there are things that we might describe as colonialism, they are never explicitly articulated as such, right? Because that's shameful. To Liao's really, really interesting question. So partly the issue that you're describing, there are examples in Algeria. There's one great example about the telephone that Augustin Jomier talked about. There was a big dispute about whether you could rely on the announcements of the beginning of Ramadan through the phone in the interwar Sahara. I think people I think are less sensitive when it comes to news of great geopolitical disturbances like wars. And there is a lot less sensitivity about using European sources of news as long as you distrust them. So you really, there's a sort of pilfering approach to news sources that you really try and take as many different things as possible. And there are lots of proverbs and things about not trusting any particular one, but you sort of plunder. And that seems to be the main kind of mechanism by which people do so. And they do so based on certain prophetic precedents. But what does this kind of lead to sort of religiously in Algeria? In a way, my period is not the best one to answer that for the television or the radio. One interesting thing that you might like is that when they start the radio in Arabic in the 1930s, they have to find people that are good speakers. And so what do? They that are good speakers, and they're loyal to the French. So they mainly take imams that are already employed by the French administration and that have good classical Arabic as the first kind of radio speakers, because they know that their pronunciation is going to be good, and so that they're not going to get complaints from listeners. And when they get people who are not classically trained, they get complaints from the listener saying this person's Arabic is really bad, which is kind of quite interesting. So yeah, I think I'll end it there.
Oh, thank you very much. I think I should bring the session to an end, but I really want to thank both Arthur and James very much for giving us such a lively exchange over what is a very lively book. I should say with parentheses that the readability of the book is an enormous advantage. This is something that if he wrote his PhD like that, I'm astounded, because it certainly doesn't read like something that originated in a PhD and is very, very readable indeed. So congratulations on that. But I'd like to thank you both very much for joining in the spirit of things this evening. But also thanks, of course, to the Abdallah Mubarak al-Sabah Foundation and to Sheikh Mubarak al-Sabah for their generous support for the prize over the years. But equally over the years, my thanks to His Excellency Khaled Doueissen, and of course, our best wishes for his speedy recovery. And many thanks also for Khaled and Khalifa for standing in for His Excellency today and setting the whole thing in motion. Francis Guy, I also want to thank as the chair of the judges and the person who's really held this together in many ways and whose initiative this was. But also thanks to Louise Hazy for helping this evening to actually work the technology, and not just the technology, but all the hidden machinery behind the scenes. You thank the judges, but it's Louise who makes sure the judges get the volumes and who does the collating of the opinions and so on, an invaluable role. So Louise, thank you very much indeed. And thanks all of you for attending, and have a very good evening or morning, depending on where you are. I can never tell in these Zoom things now. Bye-bye anyway.
Thank you.